My name is Cindy Kelly, and it's Wednesday, July 31st, 2013, and I'm here with Haskell Sheinberg, and the first question to him is, please tell us your name and spell it.
My name is Haskell Sheinberg, and the first name is Haskell, last name Sheinberg.
Perfect.
I haven't lost that much memory anyway.
That's great. Well, talking about memory, why don't you start by telling us when you were born and where you were born?
I was born December 12, 1919 in Houston, Texas, and I grew up there and went through college there at Rice University, Rice Institute there at that time.
Tell us a little about your boyhood. Were you
Uneventful.
uneventful?
Really, it was. I grew up during the Depression area, and the main thing we tried to do was, as young boys, we tried to find jobs where we could get just a few, a little bit of money to help the food and so forth. And my father was a tailor who traded clothes for food with the farmers, and that's how we got through the Depression. Yeah. And I remember very few incidents of my childhood. My memory is not that good.
So tell us about, what did you study when you went to Rice?
Chemical engineering, and when I went there, it was free. That was the only way I was able to go, and we had to pay $25 for every lab fee, for every lab course. But if you didn't break too much, you got it all back. Yeah. And books we always bought from the next class above us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what made you become interested in chemical engineering?
Well, in high school, I think we had a class or two in chemistry, on science, and that was sort of intriguing. And so I thought, well, I'll try chemical engineering. It's a combination of chemistry and engineering, and so that's why I chose that.
It was a relatively new discipline at the time, wasn't it?
I guess relatively new, yes. We had an instructor who had been doing that type of work for many, many years. So we learned certainly a lot of the practical aspects of chemical engineering. And of course we had some theory, of course. But interesting, and more things we did, the more we learned a little bit. And that was the first instance, I think, when I became acquainted with powders. Part of the things we did were, crushing and screening ores and things like that. So powders, that's the initial start of my career in powder metallurgy. Yeah, really.
So
it was interesting.
what did you do after you graduated?
After I graduated, that was in '41, and then jobs were a little difficult to get for people that were Jews, and some of the companies wouldn't interview us and that sort of thing. So I got a job with a company that was under contract to the Navy, making destroyers, where there was no discrimination allowed in federal contracts. And
I'm sorry, why were you discriminated against?
Because I was Jewish.
Ah.
Yeah. And anyway, I was there as it was called progress engineer, where I was responsible for making sure that things that had to be done with respect to building and outfitting ships was done on time, and everything was ready I included responsibilities for ship launching and ship outfitting of all kinds to make the ship fully equipped to go out to sea. And also doing engineering tests aboard ship at sea, where we, for example, run railroad tracks across the ship's deck, and then put a weighted cart and try and tilt the ship as much as you could without turning it over. Well, there were specifications as far, you had to meet how far the ship could tilt. So we had to do tests like that. So it was an interesting thing, but at that time, the Navy kept on insisting that I get deferments. And my brother was in the first draft, and he was in the Army, and I think he was due to get out in February of 41. When did the war start? 42. Yeah, anyway. But the war started in December. He was due to get out in February. But so he was staying in there for 3 years or more. And after quite a few deferments with the Navy, I said, no, I want to go in the Army. My brother's in the Army. I want to go where there's action. Because they wanted me to stay there and supervise their shipbuilding. Wanted me to stay there, but I said, no, it's time.
That wasn't exciting.
I called the draft board and told them I was giving up my deferment, and then it got me in the Army. And that's how I ended up in Los Alamos. Is that I went through infantry basic, and at the end of that, we were out on bivouac someplace, and when orders came, somebody brought an order in saying, report to the office tomorrow. Reported to the office, and they said, we're shipping you out. Didn't know where at first, but they ended up shipping to Oak Ridge first for a few days, and then we were shipped to Los Alamos in groups of 5. They would only have 5 people on a train at one time in the coming to Los Alamos under sealed orders, and we had one, I guess the fellow maybe was a private first class, and he had the orders, and he was the only one that knew where we were going. And we were on the train until we got to Lamy. And Lamy, there the Army truck met us and took us into Santa Fe to get passes, I think. And then we were trucked to Los Alamos. So that's how I got to Los Alamos.
So what do you remember about the train trip?
It was long, very long, and made frequent stops because I think other trains must have had priority. But it was long, and I do remember one stop. The fellow who was in charge of the 5 of us, Tom Mullenkamp, and he already had known that apparently liquor was not allowed in Los Alamos for GI, so he stopped at one of the stops and bought a bottle of whiskey, Southern Comfort. Yeah, I think was the name of it. Yeah, and, and that's about all I remember about the train. It was just boring.
So he bought that bottle to share with you, or
he was supposedly going to share that with us, and finally, right before we got off, he knew where we were getting off, and we had a drink. He kept most of it, of course. Yeah.
So do you remember anything about Lamy, what your impressions were?
Lamy, where am I? Because we had to wait there only a short time, so we didn't get to really look around in Lamy at all. So, but it seemed like an isolated place, and Oak Ridge, we were there only a few days, well, perhaps a week, and there we got a hint of what we're going to some place where there was a special bomb being made. You know, we're not supposed to have known that, but somehow or another, word gets around and among the privates.
So at Oak Ridge, there was a larger group. It wasn't just 5.
That was, yeah, because most of the people were staying there. They were working at Oak Ridge, and gaseous diffusion or other plants there.
So
yeah.
there were already tens of thousands of people there.
Yeah, that was apparently a good-sized city, although all we got to stay on was the post area.
Yeah,
So
they kept you isolated from the others, or
well,
not entirely?
particularly, I don't remember those details.
What about,
Not
that's okay.
Oh, I do know this. For the 5 days, there was a fellow graduate of Texas A&M who was a lieutenant, and he showed us how to transplant trees. That's all I remember. That's all we did there for 3 or 4 or 5 days.
You transplanted trees?
Yeah, oh yeah. You have to tag the tree with respect to the sun's direction, and then big enough soil around the tree, and then make sure you planted it so that it was facing the same direction with respect to the sun. So it wasn't as big a shock as just planting in any direction.
Oh.
So I learned something there.
That's great. That's great. That's the first. That's the
Yeah.
first that I've heard.
They try to learn from everything.
That's great.
Yeah, and
Now, do you remember anything about stopping in Santa Fe?
it was rather brief, but we stopped in Santa Fe, 109 East Palace, as everybody had to, and Dorothy McKibben was there in charge of the office, and she was a very nice lady, and told us that it was going to be a little bit of a drive, but up there, and I think she offered us water or something to drink, I think, and told us we would probably get refreshments when we got there. And anyway, it was just, I don't know, perhaps maybe an hour or two at the most in Santa Fe. You know? And,
So, do you remember any of your colleagues, where they were from?
I'm trying to think of their names, and I can't at the moment. Tom is the only one he's from Kentucky. At the moment, I can't think of the others'
right.
names or
Yeah,
where they're
right.
from.
They didn't turn out to be lifelong.
No. But later I made a few good friends, of course, in the Army. And,
Right.
yeah.
So, what kind of vehicle took you up the hill?
It was a truck, and I remember we were riding in the back of the truck at maybe 4x4 or 4x6, whatever they were. I don't remember for sure.
So, as you watched the scenery go by, what were your impressions?
This is totally different than living in the flatlands of Houston. These mountains and everything, and beautiful sun. I remember it was, we must have got there about close to sundown maybe. The sun was bright until we got close to Los Alamos, and by then the sun was almost down, I think, yeah. And I don't remember any particular beautiful sunrises like we normally have here. But totally different than anything I'd seen. I'd never been outside of, perhaps 300 miles from Houston or something like that. Never seen mountains like that. And I still love them. I see them out of my little apartment window.
So, where did they put you up?
Well, they had barracks built by then, and I was in C barracks, if I remember correctly. So we had on either side of the street there were Army barracks, and there was also WAC barracks a little further to the east of the men's barracks. Anyway, it was barracks life and kitchen, and I shouldn't mention this, but we at mealtime in the evenings we frequently had power shortages, and the lights would go out and then they would come back on, and there were all cockroaches on the table eating your food. That part I do remember, but in general it was just Army life without the usual strictness of any Army life, because it was, when I got there, people were working very hard, and there were shift people working different shifts. And so the Army couldn't count on anybody being in the barracks at a specific enough time to have inspections, except what we have them maybe once every 5 or 6 months, as say, inspection. So you'd have to clean up a little bit about your bed and your footlocker and things of that nature. And we didn't have any formation. You didn't have to get up and stand at attention, report in, or anything like that. It's sort of very informal with respect to Army. Yeah.
So what year or what year and month did you arrive?
In late 44, and I can't remember, it was the end of November, first part of December. I remember a foot of snow on the ground, and I was not accustomed to snow very much. We rarely had it in Houston, but I do remember, that's something I remember from childhood. My older brother and I built sleds on 2 different winters because we had enough snow in Houston so that you could be pulled on sleds, but no hills to slide down. You just essentially flat land. But
so did you enjoy playing in the snow?
well, I didn't do much playing, but certainly we had a few snowball fights. Certainly.
That's fun. And there were some scientists who liked to ski.
Oh, sure, and as well as some of the Army people too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fun.
Yeah.
So what was your assignment?
Well, the assignment was very interesting. Our first assignment was to work in purifying plutonium. Under Arthur Wahl was our group leader, only civilian, and he's one of the co-discoverers of plutonium, as you may remember. And so of course, he told us what we were going to do. There were already other people there, and you were a what's called military staff member if you had a technical degree before you went in the Army. And so we were military, and we got to know what we're working on, and the purpose of our work. And of course, lectures on security, of course, and that sort of thing, and also health physics by a gentleman, Wright Langham was his name, who showed us slides of people that used to work with painting watches with radium and everything, and he showed us all of these, everything that happened to their arm and legs, like. Anyway, something to scare you, not to scare you, but to make you totally aware of the hazards of working with plutonium. Yeah. And that was, we had that lecture, or 2 lectures perhaps, on the hazards prior to getting into the lab and doing any work. Yeah. And of course, Art told us what all to do and what to expect and how careful it had to be. And we were working with 8-gram batches. I think we must have gotten a big container from Hanford, and it was in the form of plutonium nitrate, a solution. And I guess we got measured out in the aliquot part so you could work on small quantities. One reason was that in case you had a spill, you didn't spill a big lot of plutonium, And it was a complicated process. I'm trying to remember. I remember we had an ether extraction, and it ended up somehow or another with a solution of plutonium oxalate, which we then heated and converted to plutonium oxide in powder form. And so a little bit interest in powders. And then the oxide powder was mixed with iodine and calcium and put in what was called a magnesium oxide crucible, which you placed in a Haskell an alloy, a strong alloy, cylindrical container, sealed soft copper gasket, and we heated up, and an exothermic reaction took place and heated things. You could see the outside the container getting red hot. Anyway, that reduced essentially the oxide to metal, which sank down through the slag to the bottom of the MgO crucible. And then it went to another section. Art Wahl was still in control of several different sections of this same little group, and they took care of taking the plutonium in little buttons. And at that time, I should have said that prior to doing the mixing with iodine and calcium, it took several batches together to do that operation. So you weren't working just 8 gram, but perhaps 16 or 24 or 32, something like that. Anyway, so somebody else did that part. I never was familiar with how they were doing the ingot melting. But anyway, so I did that until I guess the end of the war. And then a few years later, 2 years at the most, DP site. This was a D building in the Old Tech area. And then they started building toward the east, DP West and DP East. I think D building production is what it amounted to. Now we're working with 160 gram batches. So a totally different thing. So that was my work for perhaps 5 plus years. And of course, Art Wahl left and somebody else took over as group leader. And then a third person took over. And he was I really didn't appreciate working for him. He wanted people to be yes men, and I didn't like the idea. We were theoretically, we were engineers, so supposedly could do a little thinking of our own. And my best friend, I met my best friend there, Don Shell, who got a little disgusted before I did, and he transferred to group what is now MST6. It used to be CM6 before that, CMR6 before that, CM6. I guess it was CM6 at that time.
So that's, can you remember what that stands for? Chemical,
Chemistry
metallurgical?
and metallurgy.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. And he transferred to the powder metallurgy section in CMB6, CM6. And he liked it so well, he told me about it and what the work was and everything. And so I applied for a position in that same group. And I remember talking with Jim Taub, who was the group leader. And in the discussion, I said, well, I like to think, and I think I'm a little creative, and if you want a yes man, I don't want the job. And he said, I don't want yes men in my group. I want people to think and talk about it and talk to me about it. So,
but you think
right away a happy solution. This was January of 1950 when I made the transfer. Happy ever since I did so. Yeah. That's been my career as a powder metallurgy, ceramics, and any particle technology played with. Everything you can imagine. Instead of just concentrating on plutonium, I worked in powder form with essentially all the elements in the periodic table up to 84, that's polonium. All the non-gaseous, except technetium and praseodymium. I'll think of it. And mercury, I could never get mercury in powder form, so we didn't work with that. But work with all those metals, very interesting in powder form. If you couldn't buy it, we made our own powder, and also worked with many of the compounds of those elements with carbides, borides, nitrides, oxides, silicides, you name it. no restrictions at all on material. I even played with anything dirt and diamonds and grass, pine needles, and even got to play a little bit with moon dust. They wouldn't let us do what we wanted with it, but got to at least look at it and measure some of its characteristics. So no restrictions on material. So everything was new and challenging because a lot of information was not known on how to process these materials from powders into solid form and that sort of thing. So most interesting, challenging, stimulating work you ever met. We had a group leader who trusted us and supported us and was, at that time, there weren't a lot of paper regulations that the group leaders had to follow, so they had a little more time to go out in the lab and talk to people, see how they were doing, and frequently felt his arm on there. How you doing, chum? And that sort of thing. And this was in Sigma building, which was a totally integrated building for making anything. We had a powder metallurgy section, a ceramic section, electrochemistry section, plastic section, a foundry section, fabrication section. So we could do anything in that building, and that's what the group was supposed to do, make anything that you needed primarily for the weapons program, but we made things for a few other divisions as well. But totally interesting, and never forget those years. And we did so many of the things we did were never been done before. And one thing, I guess I had two regrets about my work. One is that I used to like to work nights and weekends a little bit, and at the expense of being with my family and kids. And the other is that we never had time to do the best job. Everything was rushed because they were testing, several bombs in Nevada every month, quite a few. And we always made critical components for, I think, almost every device that was tested, including a couple for Livermore shots. Yeah. So I rambled on a lot of things. But anyway, it was we had that. Oh, one thing I should have mentioned. Don Shell and I, when we were in D building, we moved to DP site by then. We thought that instead of doing ingot metallurgy, where you melt things and make the plutonium hemispheres or whatever, we thought, well, you should be able to make things from powder, starting with powders and pressing them and heating them up. And the glove boxes, or dry boxes we called them then, were not the best quality. And he and I had the first plutonium hydride fire ever. And so we quit working with trying to do it by powders because they are extremely active and they can catch fire very easily if exposed to any sort of air. Yeah. And so that happened there.
So can you, you already had the health physics lecture that showed your, there are consequences of, so what cautions did you take, or precautions did you take in handling the plutonium?
Well, of course, we always wore latex gloves. They were scarce because latex was being used for other purposes. We were issued 3 pair of latex gloves a week, and you had to wash them at the end of the day and then let them dry and then hang them up to dry. And then the next day you come in and you tested them by blowing them up and see if they leaked. And if they didn't leak, you reuse them. If they leaked, then you were allowed another pair of gloves. Anyway, you wore those gloves, and we worked inside of glove boxes, which are heavier gloves and that sort of thing. So lose dexterity working with thick gloves, but you had to do that for protection. And
you were describing that the quantities were very small.
oh, not when we got into Sigma building. Oh, there we're working with all different elements, you know, including enriched uranium and thorium, anything but polonium. We also did not work with polonium.
But so your glove box days were post-war, or was that during the war as well? You used glove box.
We most of the time we used hoods, as I recall, rather than glove boxes.
So a hood
Well,
would be.
we did have some. Yes, we did have some primitive glove boxes. Yes, yeah, and yeah. Anyway, we took all possible precautions, and we knew how to clean up with minor spills with a chelating agent called Versine, which we used to clean up any small spills. If it was anything large, we called health physics, and they took care of any. And by large, I mean even very small. And so we're always cautioned about protecting your health, your hands, and your rest of you. And even if you got a little scratch, then they would excise around the scratch, so you got a little wound. And if you had a wound, then you had to take special precautions, otherwise they wouldn't let you go back in the lab. Yeah. When we had nose swipes toward the end of every day to see how much you were breathing in, that sort of thing. Yeah.
You weren't wearing a mask.
Most of the time, if you're working in the glove box, you were not wearing a mask. Otherwise, if you're working in the hood or anything else, definitely you were wearing a mask. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So do you know if you or any of your colleagues were ever affected by the work you did adversely?
Yes, because in Sigma building we worked a lot with beryllium and beryllium oxide, and a few, maybe 2 or 3, were sensitive to beryllium. I worked a lot with beryllium and beryllium oxide, but I was not sensitive, so they contracted berylliosis. Yeah, and I had a cancer behind my eye, which they attributed to radiation and that sort of thing. So I was slightly affected. Yeah, but berylliosis is incurable. Cancer is curable. Well, to some extent, it's been since 2002. Yeah, so that's I've adjusted, I think, fairly well to that.
Yeah. Right.
And of course, we had a couple fatal accidents there. Perhaps Louis Slotin, yes. And I do remember that there was a fellow by the name of Al Luft in the Army who was in charge of transporting critical materials. And he had gotten a call from Louis Slotin saying, come pick up the material, I'm through with it. And so he got in his car and was driving up to pick up the material, and Slotin called and said, I decided I want to do another experiment with it. And so Luft went back to his, and that's when the accident happened. Yeah. And I remember a few others, people were in the room in close proximity. Al Graves. I can't remember the others at the moment. Interesting thing. Frank's wife was named Diz Graves. I don't know if it stood for Elizabeth. Anyway, she was highly regarded and did very, very good work, extremely good work. And they wanted to increase her salary. But the couldn't figure out a way, and finally somebody said, well, we'll make you a group leader. And she became a group leader. She was the only person in the group. But that was their way of getting around, getting her salary. She was, you know, a wonderful person to be around, you know. And for a while, in one group, CMB3, they had co-group leaders, Dwayne Beer and Don Martin. This was, I don't know, must have been the early 50s, maybe at the most. A very unusual thing. And Don Martin, they thought contracted borreliosis, and they sent him to a sanatorium in New York, and he was there for quite a while, and it finally determined that he did not have borreliosis. Nowadays they have what they call a beryllium proliferation test. They send samples to National Jewish in Denver for analysis, and they take care of all the people who have contracted beryllium, and we, yeah, sometimes you got tested. I don't remember how frequently, but to see if you had any positive tests, or sometimes you got false positives, retested, that sort of. Anyway, I do think everybody that I know of and work with had a high respect for the hazards of the materials that we worked with. We did things, a lot of things which were really unsafe. I hate to admit it, but we lucked out in most cases, and we handled large graphite dies that we took out of the furnace. They were still almost red hot. We put them on a special cart, carried them through the hallway, and burned the paint on either side of the walls, or dumped the big die assembly in ice or snow or something. Things like that, I think, again, if we had more time, we could have done things safer and better. Yeah.
So one person that we talked about on the phone is Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy?
I don't know him.
He was apparently Art Wahl's boss. He was
Joe Kennedy.
Yes.
Oh, Joe Kennedy. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. He and I. He was our division leader, and Art was a group leader under him. Yeah. And yeah, I know Joe. He was very, very capable, and realized you realized all the things that our group was able to do in Sigma building. Oh yeah. And are you familiar with Los Alamos University? It existed for only about 2 years at the most. Right after the war, I think, the end of August, Oppenheimer said he wanted a university. And so he appointed a committee, and I think they met September the 1st, and by 2 weeks later, they already had permission from Cornell and Columbia to accept credit for any course that you took there. And we had the greatest of professors. Art, I took a course in radiochemistry from Wahl and Kennedy and Friedlander, and I took a course in modern physics from, can't remember. Yeah, and after about a year or year and a half, most of the professors wanted to go back to their old jobs or universities. So the school disbanded. I gave Alan Carr a copy of the curricula for the university. Yeah, multi-page curricula. Yeah, many interesting courses there. Yeah, I subsequently took courses at the lab-sponsored And metallurgy, I'd never had a course in metallurgy, so I took a couple of courses in metallurgy and ceramics, plastics. One even took one in patent law, I guess. I had a few patents, and so just in that. Anyway, that's sort of a summary of what I've done, and worked with many different programs. At first, the laboratory was perhaps 90+% weapons work, rest biology and other things. And now it's 45%, but I say we did, I think, a good job in supplying anything that was requested. And we ran to all new materials. And for example, we made all the components for the second hydrogen weapon. First one was in liquid form, so you couldn't use it as a weapon. It was cryogenic, and the second one used lithium deuteride, enriched deuteride, and we made all of those components. And one of them and sometimes they needed special portions made out with including a different metal or anything for detector or tracer work, so they could look at things after the detonation. And I remember trying to put rhodium, which is a relatively high melting point metal, I think, about 1600 or so, I can't remember. And lithium hydride is about 850. And I loaded a charge of rhodium and lithium, and ended up heating it, hot pressing it actually, into the shape, and it came out, and there was essentially, by measuring the density, there was very little rhodium left, and we pressed it 850, and how do you get rid of that? So I was like, oh well, I made an error in what I put in there, and weight and so forth. So I had somebody watch me while I weighed things out for the second one. Same thing happened, rhodium disappeared. And so couldn't figure out what it was. So I consulted John Farr, Farr. He was a high temperature chemist in CMB3. And he played around with it and found out that there was a new class of compounds that he called rhodonyls, which are like nickel carbonate. You decompose that in forms of metal. And he called that rhodonyls anyway. Totally different class of materials. So anyway, I don't know if you ever published on that or not, but anything, there are so many things that we made that were useful for not only weapons but other technical experiments. Even for ended up, for different University of California universities, including measurement of a gravitational constant. We made parts for his assembly that he was doing way down deep in the earth. Anyway, we met a lot of interesting people from all fields that were able to work with them and make things that they needed. Cryogenic refrigerators, or you name it, whatever. And just wonderful people. That was the beauty about it. Everybody there was talented, and hardworking, and full of ideas, and everybody supported everybody else. I'm sure on almost everything I had worked on, I had somebody helping me or in some way or another. And interacted with the shops department, so I was over there all frequently trying to get things done or get it done faster or something. An interesting thing on priority of work. Weapons group, until Bradbury stopped it, had priority over everything else. And they were graded V, A, and X priority. Group leaders could assign an A priority, and division leaders could assign an X priority. But there was one that upper management was not familiar with, and that was called a PF priority, and personal favor. If you needed something and somebody could help you with it, and you could tell them the urgency of that, so you could get things done on time when it was needed. So you use that very rarely, but it was used, I think, almost throughout the laboratory, I suspect. So I doubt if the upper management, like I say, knew that was going on, but because division leaders, very high up, and they signed X priorities. After the war, it was not uncommon when people finished their work on Friday. We didn't have to work weekends. So most of the people finished their work on Friday. Sometimes they finished early, and so they say, I'm going to the library, was they really were going home or something else. And then people started saying, all the technical sites had numbers or Greek alphabets or numbers or beta site, gamma site, so forth. And others were GT site named after Gerald Tenney, who was a well-known radiologist before he came to Los Alamos. And other sites had different names, but other people started using it. Instead of going to the library, I'm going to RM site. And that's not listed on any laboratory as being a site. It's actually stood for Rocky Mountain Bar down in Totavi. You would before you get to Los Alamos, there's a little area that has a service station and a couple of houses. That's Totavi, and that's where the bar was located. And so that was known as RM site. That's a little bit of humor, but yeah.
Did you ever go, thinking of sites off the hill, there was Edith Warner's tea house.
No. I doubt if many people in the Army were invited to that. No. That's primarily a civilian.
Yeah. Now, did you go to Trinity?
No. We were still working on purifying material for the next weapon.
Right.
Yeah, and we didn't get to go up. A lot of people went up to what's it called? Oh my goodness, can't remember the name of the area, up in the mountains, so you could see the shot when it went off. And we couldn't go. We were waiting a shipment from Hanford. So in those days, you still had to, as soon as something came in from Hanford, you had to get started on it. And I remember, I think we were playing poker when actually waiting for the next shipment. So we didn't get to go up there. We just sit around and wait, for the shipment. And but we heard relatively soon that the weapon went off. Yeah.
But you knew the test was happening.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was among, I think, the military staff, well, of course, most of the civilian sciences knew. But there were so many in the Army that, it was an Army post, P.O. Box 180, and a good deal of the Army Special Engineer Detachment were not, did not have Q clearances. They didn't know what they were working on or what the things were for. The shops department were, and other crafts did not have access to that information, but they contributed so much to, things couldn't have been done without people in the shops and the crafts. They rarely got credit for their work. And, the shops department would interact with whoever was designing any sort of component. At least if you were on the ball, you really, when things done, you interacted closely with the shops to get things the physicist would demand perhaps very strict tolerance on dimensions and so forth. And the shops department would say, well, we can't meet those, we can come close. And so, sort of get together to compromise on what could be done. But the shops department should get a lot of credit for all the work that went. One of the physicists actually, I don't know many of them that ever worked on any part of the weapon, but George Kistiakowsky is in the, I think, S site. He had in charge of the work going on there. He actually, I think, helped in actually making some of the high explosives that were used. We had one fellow named Kiski and the other named Kowski, and this was Kistiakowsky. So, I had some friends. One family, their names were Brooms, and the others were Brushes. And the Brooms and the Brushes were good friends, and we interacted with the Brooms and the Brushes. So, little oddities like that, I remember. All in all, most satisfying career. And I retired in 1990 officially, but I worked another 5 years, I think, full time, and then 10 years part time. And I still interact with people there. They call me up because a lot of things are same sort of thing we did many years ago, and I went up there for, well, there was one special kind of device, totally different, that we worked on in the 80s, and it was the only one that we were not able to succeed at. And then it was needed in the 1980s, and now, I think in the modern age, we need it even more. So I stewed about it for many months, and I finally made phone calls trying to get several of the people interested, but I couldn't describe anything because everything that I'd worked on was classified, even the title of the name of the device. So I had to give hints, and all I could do, and told them the name, at least gave them one clue, the name started with a T. And my division leader at the time, Don Sandstrom, always blamed CMB-6 for the not having a success, but we had to get our material from CMB-3, and that material varied considerably. They were making small lots. Every batch was different, and so we were never able to, came close, but never able to make the parts. And anyway, so I gave that group leader, Don Sandstrom, a call and tried to give him hints, and he could not remember. I couldn't imagine his forgetting that we had a failure. And so I called Jim Smith. I don't know if you met him. He's a lab fellow also. And I gave him the hints, and he couldn't find out. He came up with the name Terrazzo, but that was the name of another device. And finally, he kept talking around with different people. And he talked to the present group leader of CMB-6, who knew what it all meant, what the material was, and so forth. And so they called me up for a classified meeting, but my clearance was suspended because of underutilization. You have to use your badge every 90 days. So anyway, I went up there where I could talk anything classified that I wanted to, but if I said something, they could not either deny or affirm that that was right or anything, because they had clearance and I didn't, so that would give me clues which I was not entitled to. Anyway, very nice discussion for a few hours, and also gave them a name of a report where I designed a unique die assembly. Anyway, I gave them the name of another classified report that I'd written describing type of die assembly, and referred them to that. And then also, briefly I had to leave for another meeting. I gave one of the other attendees the name of another report which described in detail how the time, pressure, and temperature cycles that we use for making different sorts of objects out of the same material, so they could see what they were up against with respect to that. Anyway, it was useful for me. And then in the afternoon, the new director, McMillan, was talking to the lab fellows, so I went to that meeting. And anyway, yeah.
So it goes on.
Pardon?
So you have had a very, very long and active career.
Right. Oh, I did. And I might mention this woman who called from the lab for that interview said, describe your most important achievements in your life. And so I did that. There was one program, 450 people working on it, a non-weapons program, nuclear rocket propulsion engines, called Rover program. And I said that next to father and my two wonderful sons, which was my best achievement, working on that program, I invented and developed the process we used for making fuel elements for that program. So I consider that my most important achievement, even though it was non-weapons. Yeah.
That's marvelous. Yeah, the rover is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and I think it turns out now, that the president said we're going to have a manned mission to Mars, that they're now working on the same, very similar type of fuel element materials. So I've gotten a few phone calls with that. Well, it's great to feel needed every now and then,
I'm sure it does, yeah. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
So are there other questions I should ask? About your career, or how about your thoughts looking back? Are you, this is sort of a strange time in the course of world history, and weapons in particular. How have your views of nuclear weapons changed over the years?
Well, when the Cold War started, then I supported the fact that I think we should be ahead of the Russians. Oh yeah, and but after now there's stockpiled so many things. I don't see the need for any big supply of stockpiled or armed devices like we have now. I was glad the plutonium device was tested in Trinity, worked. I was happy about that, and I was glad that the bombs were used to help end the war, because I felt it saved a large number of American lives, which at that time I valued over other people's lives. I don't regret having worked on that type of program, but nowadays I don't see the need for. I see the need for this particular little device, but not having a big stockpile of the others, and so that part has changed, and we worked. I think practically everybody felt the need that we should stay ahead of the Russians, and so I think there was a lot of opposition to actually dropping the bombs, as you may remember, and supposedly a petition went around in Los Alamos to sign, let's not drop the weapon, let's do a test. Now I didn't get to see the petition, but I heard that it went around, and so I didn't get a chance to sign it. But I think in general I felt it was the right thing. So, for example, I don't know if you've read a lot about the history of, part of the history where Einstein and so many major scientists tried to persuade the military not to use it. There's a book called Brighter Than a Thousand Suns. In case you haven't read that, you might look at the rear end of that book and it'll tell you about all the opposition to dropping it. But one of the possibilities was making a test, you know, and have the Japanese witness the testing of a weapon. But of course, the chances were, well, wow, there's a new design, you know, it worked on Trinity. Maybe this one won't work. It may, you know, something may have been done different. You couldn't meet the tolerances or something. Anyway, so the military, you know, once they have a weapon, they feel the need to use it. And I think they persuaded Truman that they should drop the weapon. But have you read part about the Potsdam Declaration, Potsdam meetings? Yeah, okay, so you know that Harry Truman sent the second declaration. I remember part of that was that the Japanese government refused to accept the Potsdam Declaration, which did not call for unconditional surrender. And he said that if this is rejected, the Japanese people would face utter destruction and they will see a rain of ruin from the air, which the world has never seen before. And they refused to accept Truman's declaration. So there was a total of, I think, about 9 days in which they had that could have prevented the detonation of dropping of the bomb. So I blame the Japanese government. Apparently, the emperor didn't make that decision, but I guess the military primarily did. At least that's the way I understand the history of the Declaration. There was a dog named Timoshenko. He was a Russian wolfhound, and he was the only dog allowed into the tech area, main tech area. I mentioned that, of course, to Alan, of course, too. And thinking a year or two later, after the war, a Great Dane by the name of Cleopatra was allowed into the electrochemistry section of MST6. Yeah. Very minor little things.
That's great.
Any significance that I can think of at the moment. Yeah.
Were the dogs kind of mascots?
They were just allowed to roam, except the one in electrochemistry was primarily just in Sigma built. Yeah. Always had the tail bandaged because it kept banging up against things. Well, I belonged to this small group called Fine Particle Society, and like I say, probably only about 60 members at the most throughout the country, all interested in characteristics of powders that they felt were probably influencing their products. The coffee makers wanting to get the proper grind for size powders to maximize flavor extraction. Soap industry wanted to put what size particles to put in their soaps to make them abrasive and not too abrasive. And certainly the pharmaceutical industry in many respects wanting to know how do you make the powders flowable so they fill up the dye completely so they can be compressed into good solid pills, that aspirin and that sort of thing. And let's see, of course, cement industries and oh my goodness, trying to think of a few others. I can't at the moment. Wow.
Oh, that's good. So maybe you can just,
as I could think about it more, I'll tell you.
Talk about how, in your assignment during the Manhattan Project was to look at the powder form of plutonium, something like that.
Yeah. Well, that was I guess an alternative way of making things that Don Shell and I thought of doing, because powder industry was certainly in full bloom, and people were making all sorts of products starting with the powders rather than casting materials and melting them. And when you melt things, you essentially destroy some of the past history of the materials that you're melting. In powder metallurgy, making things from powders, you eliminate very little of the history of the powders, how they were made and what their shapes were and that sort of thing. So there were advantages that we thought there would be. So we got permission. After the war, then a little bit more plutonium became available, so you could do experiments. So we got enough to try and make a small pellet out of plutonium by first converting it to the hydride, which if you have metal and you convert it to the hydride, it forms a powder instead of being a massive ingot. And then you can reduce that back to the metal by heating it up, and the hydride decomposes back into metal. So now you've made things with finer grains, and in most the tensile strength and compressive strength and things, the properties are inversely proportional to the size of the grains. So the finer you can keep the grains, the better the product. So we thought that's a big advantage. But when our attempt to do this would convert the plutonium to hydride, the glove boxes in which we were working were not very good, and enough air got in, so it caused a fire. And that's one thing you don't like to have happen in a box or outside of a box. But there wasn't enough powder, so it only lasted maybe a couple hours at the most. Nothing one could do about it. In most uranium fire, when I went to Sigma building, we had worked quite a bit with uranium and in powder form also. And we've had a few fires, but in those fires you're actually using hoods if it was not enriched uranium. And you just throw graphite on it and put the fires out readily. So it wasn't as big a concern with uranium, but plutonium, you just don't want to have a fire or anything bad happen to it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, before I don't want to get off on this too much, because there were a few things that I wanted to go back to that you mentioned. One is if you could talk about Oppenheimer a little bit.
Oppenheimer, I never met personally, but I went to the weekly colloquiums as our work schedule permitted. And the colloquiums there were primarily speakers from different groups and divisions stating the projects they were working on and the progress they were making, the lack of progress due to problems, and always ending up with, these are my major problems and who can help me? And of course the attitude of Oppenheimer was that you talk to anybody in the laboratory who can help you in your work. And so there was a lot of interchange and interdisciplinary interactions with people. So somebody from one discipline might have a totally different outlook on what his problem really was, or the origin of his problem. Sometimes it went back to the basic materials they tried, the properties of the materials that they started with, or some way that they're doing manufacturing, that's hardly the word, making just a few parts, how you could do it better, or different ideas. And people felt free to say things, what they thought about things. And Oppenheimer was the one, I think, that really inspired all of us to interact with everybody else, that we needed to do our job better. And he certainly motivated, and the other good thing, he trusted everybody, I think, to do their best and do it honestly and help others. And of course, be safe. He did stress that. So I think everybody tried to adhere to Oppenheimer's way that he managed the lab, ran the lab, yeah. And I think he really knew what was going on in in a good part of the laboratory. Yeah. Of course, he couldn't get around to the laboratory is pretty well spread out, even though it was just the one technical area in the old technical area where the city is now. Yeah. Where part of the city is now. Yeah. But always interesting. And for example, Ed Mack, yeah, he was the head of, I think, of the photography group for photographing Trinity to see what came out. And Beryl Brixner was one of the camera operators who took photographs. He had the best photographs of the Trinity shot than anybody else. So I can't remember the name of the fellow who designed the high-speed camera that he used. But anyway, there were talks about how you do the diagnostics based on the film that they produced, and there are other ways of measuring the yield of weapons as well. But they talked about their problems in laying out miles and miles of cables going to the explosives and things of that nature, and the diagnostic cables. You know. And anyway, the talks like that were intriguing to me, altogether different fields, but you learned something from everybody that spoke, and all different subjects, like how do you make how they were progressing with making high explosives, which were needed for the Fat Man or the Trinity shot. And I don't know, it's always learning experiences, and I guess I always felt, I used to tell people, I said, make everybody your teacher and be both a student and a teacher, because you can learn from everybody. If designing and redesigning a bathroom, you talk to the janitor and find out. Everybody's got ideas on something that they think is something good in the way you do things. But anyways, we had so many just challenging things to do, and no references. You can't look up in a book anywhere and see, well, how do you do this? How do you make arsenic cylinders at a certain density or pressure or something like that? Any kind of material. So, totally enjoyable experience in every way, you know, learning experience. So I tried to mentor some of the newer staff members and technicians. And, we had in Sigma building, the group leader, Jim Taub, who just passed away, I heard it yesterday, was group leader, I think, for 29 years. And he, again, motivated and trusted us and supported us.
Well, you might want to mention, since you just brought it up, that the Sigma building has a secure conference room that's been named. Can you talk about that?
Well, this was 2005. I was retired, and I think still working part-time. But anyway, one of my close friends, who was also a laboratory fellow, Jim Smith, said, okay, we got to go to this. It's going to be an important meeting. You ought to come to that. So I went with him, and we were sitting in maybe the middle of the conference room. And it was called the Black and Blue Room. And then lo and behold, my son and his wife and the woman I was going with at the time, they walked in the building, into the room under escort, and I couldn't not imagine why they were there, or what they were doing there, or anything else. And I exclaimed to Jim, what are they doing here? How did they? Anyway, it turned out prior to the time that they came in, people were giving reports that different from the different sections, you know, maybe taking 5 or 10 minutes on each report and sort of giving people a flavor of what was going on in their departments or sections. And this meeting was crazy. The people would get up and just talk for a minute or two and just sit down. And it was the funniest meeting I had ever attended. And then the group leader got up and said what was going on, and and that they were dedicating the conference room to my name. Yeah. So it's quite an honor to receive. Anyway, it's still called that. Now there's a nice plaque on the door. Oh, the machine shop, before they knew the requirements that you had to have a special kind of plaque, they made a beautiful bronze, polished bronze plate, about 3/4 of an inch thick, maybe this big. Haskell Sheinberg conference room, beautifully polished and everything, and that was hung up there for a while. And it turned out that the laboratory rules were that you had to have a sort of three-dimensional plaque instead of just a sign like that. So I think that plaque is up there now. And that was in the days before I lost the use of this eye. But anyway, so that's quite an honor, you know. Supposedly I made a lot of achievements there. You know.
Absolutely.
I've got quite a few patents and that sort of thing. So I was creative, I think. Oh, yes, I kept a picture of Einstein in my office underneath which he says, imagination is more important than knowledge. And I went in and after working on quite a few months or years on a project, and I said to my group there, I said, Jim, I think, you know, I worked pretty hard and I think I've done a real good job, and I don't have a lot of knowledge, I don't claim to that, but I have a lot of imagination. Can I have a raise? And he kicked me out of the office. He said, go to work. Anyway, I did subsequently get a raise. I think I was quite creative in my youth then. I would say I've got, 26, I think, foreign and domestic patents. Yeah. Anyway, so interesting. I wouldn't trade that career for anybody's, but it's the people that always supported you. That rarely did a person do anything, complete a big project by himself. It was always with the help of somebody else, and so much talent there, and trust in people. And I forget, I read someplace that there's so much you can do so much if you don't care who gets the credit. And I think that was the way people thought about then. They helped everybody. Everybody helped each other. And I don't think you find that in the laboratory today. Yeah. And the morale was always high, except we had one fatality in our group, and that was a sad time. Yeah. So we've had a couple of sad times. One fellow lost 2 fingers, and during all those years we're doing the most hazardous of operations in different groups and different sections in Sigma building. So there are many potential hazards and safety problems, but I think we ended up pretty lucky with respect to injuries and so forth. Yeah.
That's great. One other thing that we need to talk about, or I'd like you to talk about, is your wife.
Oh yeah.
Right, and first, what her job was, what her background was, what her job was, how you met.
Her background was.
Tell me her name, please.
Beatrice Freeman was her name, and she was from New Jersey, and she enlisted in the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, which later got changed to Women's Army Corps. And she did her training in Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, I think it is, and they tested the women psychologically in every way they could to see if they could take an isolated life and all this sort of thing, and what they could put up with. And so she was sent to Los Alamos in, I think, October of '43. I think in the 2nd detachment of WACS, I think. And she worked at first in the ceramic section, making magnesium and other kind of crucibles that we could cast uranium or plutonium in, that sort of thing. and she did quite good work. The group consisted of one civilian group leader, all the rest military staff members, Army, and 2 technicians. My wife and one other woman, Evelyn Sargent, were the only technicians in the group, both women and both in the Women's Auxiliary Corps. And then later she worked with in the enriched uranium foundry, where she was responsible for cleaning and weighing the as-cast and machine parts and the chips and so forth, and it being, because everything had to be accountable to, I think with uranium, a gram, or perhaps a tenth of a gram, I can't remember now. But she had to keep records on all of that, as well as doing all the cleaning and weighing and so forth, using carbon tetrachloride, unfortunately, as a solvent, which turned out to be quite hazardous. Anyway, she did apparently a good job there, and in Oppenheimer's letter of commendation that he wrote to her, he specified that the work that she did with refractory material, the crucible type things, and in the accountability and record keeping and other operations with certain materials, because he didn't mention uranium or plutonium, I think, in any letter that he wrote to all of us, each of us, I should say. Yeah. So, anyway, so she enjoyed that, and later, well, can't remember now, but several years later, she transferred to a business group, and she did accounting, I guess. It was not professionally, but the type of accounting that was necessary, and I guess ordering and receiving materials and that sort of thing. And then we were married, I think, 5 years before.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Huh?
You have to tell me how you met.
How we met. We met on a blind date, and one of her friends and my friend introduced us, and we at the rec hall, and I was not a good dancer or dancer at all, and she was a good dancer. So she danced with a lot of men there while I was sitting in the bleachers and watching, being sort of envious of people who could dance, of men who could dance. And then we subsequently started dating, if you can call it that. There was not much to do. Go to the movie or go to the rec hall. And anyway, I guess fell in love, and then let's see, I think she got discharged a couple months before I did, in '46, and she went back to New Jersey, and I got discharged. And I mentioned to you privately that I went to a good friend of mine in the Army went to my home for a couple weeks, and then to his home in Shamokin, Pennsylvania, and then went back later to New York. Bea and I met in New York after watching the St. Patrick's Day parade. Then I proposed to her. We got married. That was March 17th, and we got married middle of October of that year. Yeah. Then we we decided to wait a year before we tried to have children, and the year came by, and then we tried it weren't successful for about 5 years. So finally ended up having 2 boys, both born prematurely, but both of them did okay. And one was born in the old hospital, and the other one in the new hospital, the one that exists now. Oppenheimer, and I think most people who knew him called him Oppie, but of course we always referred to him as Mr. Oppenheimer. He issued a dictum saying that only persons with medical degrees shall be referred to as doctor. Oh yeah, because, well, I think security was one reason he didn't want people, like when people would get together and talk, they would say, Dr. So, Dr. So, Dr. So. so people would maybe get some sort of clues as to what was going on. I think security entered that dictum, but it was adhered to, certainly. You know. Then Oppenheimer, I think, was able to delegate, and he certainly motivated everybody. He seemed to be warm, and you wanted to do things for him. You wanted to do the best you could for him in every way. And I think he trusted all the people that he had as division leaders and our group leaders. And he got to know a lot about what was going on in a good part of the laboratory. Certainly, he, of course, couldn't take time to go to all parts of the laboratory. But apparently his door was essentially open to all of his division leaders and group leaders. And I guess if anybody else had a crisis, that could talk to somebody first, I forget who it was, and that if you thought it was serious enough, the person could go talk to Oppenheimer. Yeah. And the only person you heard mentioned on a loudspeaker system in the administration building was J.J. Gutierrez. You would hear that call. J.J. Gutierrez called this maybe every 5 or 10 minutes, and he was in charge of all the custodian work and that sort of thing. So his name was mentioned more than Oppenheimer's on the communication system, the loudspeaker system in the main administration building. You know, I'll never forget that name. Couldn't imagine who he was. I thought, gee, maybe he was Oppenheimer's assistant. You know, turned out he was head of the custodial work. Yeah. Yeah. But I don't know, you felt so comfortable in the colloquium every week when you were able to go to, there, and you felt like you were in the company of a man who was the right man for the job that he was doing, and he was strictly a people person as far as I could tell. Yeah.
That's great.
But a pleasure to try and do your best. Yeah.
That's great. One thing that in interpreting the Manhattan Project Los Alamos that we have been asked to try to keep in mind is to bring out the role of the Hispanics. If you could talk about that.
Yes. I think the Hispanics did not have a prominent role at the staff level. A good deal of them were technicians. Their wives, from the valley, would come up and do custodial work for the civilians in their apartments. But there weren't many people at all in any sort of position, like, I don't think even group leader, much less division, no Hispanic name. And there were, of course, some discrimination and how do you say, don't spit on the floor? I can't remember now. No escuela en el suelo. In Spanish, never in English, so that you knew that the signs referred to the Hispanic people. So it's like expecting them not to have the same manners or do things the same way as the non-Hispanics. I felt that was discrimination of the worst kind, and the few times that I was in the administration building and saw that sign.
I'm sorry.
Don't spit on the floor, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I see. Don't spit on the floor was in Spanish only?
Only in Spanish, yeah. Yeah. So I didn't like that at all. Yeah. But later on, then they assumed the same kind of staff positions as the non-Hispanics. In fact, as I recall, Pete Miller, who was the assistant, one of the assistant directors, I'm trying to think, was it Bradbury or after Bradbury, I think, was Hispanic. And quite a few people in the weapons group rose to high positions as Hispanics, and certainly it doesn't matter what your background is or anything. It's what's up here and here that counts, and your talents, of course.
Good.
So there was that discrimination. Oh, and the worst part about it, in the security handbook, so many Hispanics lived off the hill in the valley, Espanola and surrounding. They were not allowed to socialize with their families. What you should do sometime, if you haven't read it, is read the security handbook that was passed out. It was very rough on those people who were, most of them Hispanic or Indian, and so I think it was quite rough on those people. They're supposed to all avoid as much contact as possible with their families. That lived in the valley. I mean, not a husband and wife relation, but cousins and aunts and uncles, that sort of,
Not for security purposes. Pardon? You couldn't rationalize that directive from security point of view.
I don't think so. So that was the type of discrimination that I saw there. And I had a boss for 10 years. He was a section leader, and the only one I ever didn't really feel good about working for, and later we found a staff member, actually section leader, found a paper by the subsequent group leader who said he was a technically incompetent, psychopathic liar and an embarrassment to the laboratory. And I agreed with that, except I would have added the word bigoted, because if anything went wrong, he blamed it on the explicative Mexicans. Yeah, and I'm sure he did that with, if I think maybe I messed up in those so-called Jews. Yeah. No, that was the roughest 10 years I had at the laboratory, but I was tempted several times to look for a different job, but I was in love with my job, I guess is what it was, and so I stayed there, and then they took him out of a position so he would no longer interact with people, per se, did expediting and outside work, but he apparently did a good job of that. Socially, he was a very nice guy, but he was not the guy for that. And when the time came for personnel security every 5 years, the FBI asked, he had listed me as a reference, and I told him I refused to endorse him on a security basis, because I'd been with him in meetings. He would drink a little too much, and he would say things that were classified, and on several occasions, so I refused to do that. And they asked me why, and I said I'd rather not state why, but I have it on very what I consider valid grounds that he is not the person who should have high security clearance, that is.